It's a privilege to be here with all of you this morning to talk to these two extraordinary journalists. We have such a hard topic, and it was difficult listening to Maria just now as well, I think. So I'm grateful that you're all here to think seriously about the question of how it is, in even the most intimate contexts, we can see abuses of power and hold people accountable for them. That's precisely what these two journalists have done, and they have a lot to teach us about the complexity of doing that and the hard question of how exactly it is we really can protect the most vulnerable people. I wanted to start by asking them to share more about their own work and stories with us. I'm going to start with Sacha, turn to the question of the abuse by priests here in the Boston area, the Catholic Church. And one of the things that's so striking about that is how long this all played out. So there's a sentence from one of the early articles. Why did it take a succession of 3 cardinals and many bishops 34 years to place children out of Father Gagin's reach? 34 years. I want to underscore that because I'm a historian of, among other things, the American Revolution. And often historians consider that incredibly transformative period to have really kicked in 1765 with the Stamp Act, and then by 1776 you get a revolution. 10 years, 34 years to see the abuse of children and do something about it. So, Sacha, there were rumors circulating, there had been little pieces of evidence cropping up over the decades. Why did it turn into a story when it did? How did that happen for the Spotlight team?
We've often said that, by no means did the Globe discover the phenomenon of clergy sex abuse. I mean, for many years, media outlets in Boston and other parts of the country had been writing about priests who abused children. What the Globe did that was different was write about not just priests who abuse children, but church officials who cover up for priests who abuse children. And through our reporting, we learned that it was systemic, it was systematic, that the church really, its goal was not to I think the exact wording was to avoid scandal. We found cases often where parents were coming to church officials, they were being asked to sign confidentiality clauses, being told, we'll take this priest out of parish, here's a check, and then that priest would be transferred from the North Shore of Boston to the South Shore. And in a pre-internet era, you can lose people that way. I mean, it's easier to find people now. So in our case, Marty Barron, who's now the executive editor of the Washington Post, had come to the Globe in summer of 2001. And, it's funny, I think that we often feel that when new bosses come to town, they know exactly what they want to do, they have a plan. And I've only learned in recent years that, Marty didn't know Boston that well, he had never lived in Boston, he had read some signature books about the city, but he basically came to work every day in his early days at the Globe just reading the newspaper, trying to learn things, trying to find potential story ideas. And one of our columnists, Eileen McNamara, had written a column in which she mentioned a case involving John Gagin. He was one of the most notorious abusers in the Boston Archdiocese. 6 parishes, 30 years, a trail of victims. The columnist had made a reference to all those files being sealed by the courts. And she said, so the truth will never be known. And Marty, with the fresh eyes coming into a new editor, felt like that was sort of waving a red flag before a bull. What do you mean the truth will never be known? And he had turned to the Globe in our morning meeting and said, well, did anyone ever try to unseal these files? And there was sort of this embarrassed silence because I think people had just become kind of acculturated to the fact that those files are not accessible because they're sealed, when in fact we probably should have been thinking about unsealing them. So Marty did 2 things simultaneously. He asked the Globe's lawyers to try to go and unseal those files, which they did, but that took about 5 or 6 months. And he asked the Spotlight team, which I was then on, to figure out what we could find out with the little information we had at that point, and that's what launched that project.
So that's an extraordinary comment because, in effect, what you're sharing with us is that it was not just the families and the children who were quieted by the authority of the church, but actually the most important accountability institution in the area too.
Yeah, I think there was a deference to the church, particularly in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, when the Catholic Church had enormous influence in Boston. Half the city was Catholic. And I think that maybe we weren't as aggressive as we should have been. And I think that changed also as deference to the church eroded over time.
So I'm going to come back to that. I think it's a really important point, how this deference grows up. You use the word insidious in one of your articles, but I think it's a great word for thinking about the problem of power in intimate context. But I want to ask Sara to share a little bit about her story. It's a very different story. You also broke a big sex abuse scandal. Children affected by predatory treatment. There's what one has to call it. That is simply the case. And you had to start working on your own. You got some tips. You moved different papers. You're the person who broke the story. Share with us how things built. Again, how did it turn into a story?
This was something that came to me as just a good old-fashioned tip, right? I was a crime reporter. Someone told me, this may be something you want to look into. But it took 2 years before we were able to write a story that just hit the surface of what was happening. Unlike in the Boston case, I think in Sandusky, in the case at Penn State, it wasn't a well-known thing that Jerry Sandusky was a pedophile amongst the public. This wasn't something you were ever going to find in newspaper clippings, but in talking to people, there were odd things about this man. What we were up against was the fact that this was a very small, intimate, but also very powerful community, and he was a god to them. Second only to Joe Paterno was this man, he was a saint. He was not just a great football coach, to many he was even a better coach than Paterno, but he was also a charity founder, he was a family man, he adopted kids. I mean, he had built a perfect life. And it was very difficult to find anyone who would speak ill of him, especially when you're talking at that point about just rumors. And so it really took chipping away one little piece by one little piece by one little piece, and then stringing that all together in order to get an idea of what was happening. What really happened is a young boy, a teenage boy, had gone to police and made a report of abuse. But he was one kid making a report against this Goliath. And he really wasn't believed at first. And he was among others who had made reports and had been not believed. And it was only in going back and kind of relitigating, opening up old police investigations and talking to people who had either tried to report or considered reporting or had reported and then been shot down, were we able to figure out that it wasn't just one boy making one allegation. This was a pattern of abuse.
So there's a really striking detail, I think, about the story of the high school student who goes to make that first report. Tell me if I've got this right. My memory is that he first told his mother the story, and his mother immediately said, "We've got to go talk to the school," and then they went straight to the police. And this is unusual that there's such an immediate response, right? That it had happened recently, they turned right around, contrasted to the stories in the Boston case where people sat on them for years. But the detail that was striking is the mother's role. In both of your stories, mothers are all the way through these stories. I don't think there was a single father in either of your sets of stories. So just talk a little bit about, what is it, the mother's role here? Who is seeing what in domestic context, and how does that make a difference?
Well, in the case of Jerry Sandusky, you're right. There were no fathers, and that was a big reason that these victims were silenced for so long, because he preyed on boys from his children's charity, and his children's charity was there to help the disadvantaged kids. So the kids that he could easily call liars if they made an allegation against him, the kids who did not have, a lot of times, fathers or a good family unit. You did see some strong parenting. In some cases, you didn't see some strong parenting, too. He was their father figure. And for a lot of those kids, when you sit through the trial and looked at them testifying, it was so difficult for them because they weren't just talking about something that they, not the most comfortable subject, something that they were ashamed of, but something, they were actually sitting there testifying against a man who they at one point considered to be their father figure. And in the most, the best example you can give of that is a boy who he had actually adopted, legally adopted. He had his own adopted son, had to go to the police and say, yes, my adopted father, whose name I took legally, was abusing me during my childhood. So it was a theme.
Right.
In our cases, we had some cases where parents came forward together, but certainly it was oftentimes, as Sara said, only mothers, because those are basically the kids that were targeted.
Right.
You know, after we published our stories, I remember getting a call from someone who said to me, do you really think your team broke some story? I mean, we always knew there were certain priests you didn't send your kids away with on a ski trip for the weekend. And I was kind of amazed by that comment. Because yes, some people sort of were in the know, but probably that was a relatively stable two-parent family where a priest was not going to target that family, because keep in mind, the priests who were they had intimate knowledge of these families and what their personal situations were, what their financial situations were. And so oftentimes the priest would go after the broken homes, the single-parent homes where the mother was so grateful if a priest could put a child to bed that night or take him out for ice cream. Or maybe kids that they knew were confused about their sexual identity, were very vulnerable because maybe this was a child trying to figure out, am I gay? So you had these kinds of people being profiled. We often hear about the grooming process of pedophiles. We absolutely saw that in these stories.
Can you say more what you mean by that, about the grooming process? I'm sorry.
Well, the idea that pedophiles are often picking a certain type of person that they know will be vulnerable. I mean, I think we saw that with the type of people that were, the type of kids who might need a charity are also the type of kids who might make good targets. You know, the type of kids that the priests were aware came from difficult homes often made good targets. And also are kids who may not be likely to be believed if they were to ever report a priest had abused them because they came from troubled homes. So it was a very terrible cycle.
So I think this actually takes us into one of the hardest issues, which is this combination of a question of how one sees abuse in the first place and how there are practices of accountability to deal with it. We have an instinct that we want the law to solve these problems. And the law helps, right? The law has set up requirements that people in caring professions, people responsible for juveniles, be mandatory reporters. Although there are some interesting details about this fact in the Boston case. Yet, mandatory reporters in the athletics case, those folks were mandatory reporters too, they didn't report. So somehow the law doesn't get us where we need to get. Mothers do something, they can't do everything. How should we think about what the law can do and what other things are that we can do?
One of the things I find to be very interesting about this panel is that Sacha's story broke 5 years before mine, if not more, maybe 6 or 7.
2002, 2011.
So, 9 years before mine. So laws changed after her reporting. A significant amount of change was taken. But this is not just about the law. This is a cultural thing. This is the way that people talk about this issue or don't speak about it. A lot of times parents are not having these conversations with their young boys when they send them off to camps. Whether it be sports camps or church camps. It's not a comfortable conversation. A lot of times, young kids don't report this. And a lot of times, witnesses to the abuse don't feel comfortable coming forward. So it's not just about the laws, but I think it's really interesting that, you know, after the world was stunned by the cover-up that happened within the Catholic Church, not a single person at Penn State who saw Jerry Sandusky in a shower with a 10-year-old boy, giving him a massage, holding him, his arms wrapped around him, his shoulders, bringing him to events as his date, sitting at a table. No one ever touching him, holding his leg in the car or in a chair, seated next to someone. No one ever spoke up and said that that's not right. Something's not right here. And this is after we had been talking about a culture of abuse and cover-up for at least 9 years.
You mentioned the what's called the mandated reporting law that many states have. And this requires people who work with children, doctors, teachers, that if they suspect some kind of abuse, they need to report it to the state. They're mandated to report. Connecticut, for example, has had this law in place since the 1970s that also applies to priests and church employees. The Boston Archdiocese actively lobbied for years against having priests and church employees included in the Massachusetts mandated reporting law. That changed in 2002 as a result of the stories we did. So I think it's probably likely that less abuse happens. But again, oftentimes kids don't report till later. So oftentimes it can be years before we know it happens. So I think Sarah's right. I mean, I think it's important for those conversations to be happening between parents and children.
That's great, thank you. So there's so much more to pursue along this line, and I will probably come back to it as well, but I want to make sure we don't lose sight of the incredible work each of you did as a reporter. And in the body of stories that won the Pulitzer Prize, which for those of you who don't know, you can go to pulitzer.org and you can read all of the stories in each of these Pulitzer-winning packages. And I highly recommend doing that. It's a treasure trove of excellent journalism, and the amount you can learn from them is it's really something. But so there are really compelling interviews that each of you did. And this has been something I've been just really struggling to understand. How is it? I mean, it's got to be a different kind of investigative experience to be talking to people where the exact problem that they have is that somebody in authority has taken advantage of them. And you are people in authority. So tell us about that process of working with sources for these stories. Sacha?
I think one of the things you have to remember for why this was so difficult for people to talk to us about, and these were mostly now adult men who were abused when they were children or teenagers, is that a lot of times this abuse happened in the 50s, 60s, 70s. And a lot of times these were gay men struggling with sexual identity. Sometimes they weren't. But it was an era when people talked much less, we were much less open about sexuality. So I think that our view can be a little skewed today because we are so open to remember what a stigma it felt like if you were afraid you were gay, you were worried your family was going to ostracize you. And so that made people concerned. I mean, I had victims say to me, because this happened to me, I wonder if I am gay. I mean, it was this sort of heartbreaking process to go through them trying to understand what had happened even decades earlier. But they were left with this fear that their family might reject them, and that made them reluctant to talk even to us in the 2000s. But I found it was very difficult, but I found that when we did get people to talk, those people became the pioneers for other people who came later because they broke down that sense that there was some shame in talking about it. And I think for many other victims, it was very liberating. But these were oftentimes people who were telling us stories they had never told anyone before, including their spouses. You may feel this way about being a reporter, but sometimes I feel like we're almost protecting people from themselves. And as an example of that, I had one man call me. He was in his 50s, and he said, I'm finally ready to go public about the story about the priest who abused me, and my wife doesn't even know yet. And, I said, you have to tell your wife. She can't read that in the newspaper. But that, people really finally, But I think that people finally were willing to talk about it. They felt emboldened. They felt liberated.
So let's just talk about that individual for one more moment. You say he called you and said, I'm finally ready to talk about it. What happened before that? How did you find him? What kind of invitation or request did you put on the table to him?
Initially, when we found victims, it was very difficult because there were very few people public. There was a group called Survivors Network of Those Abused by Priests, SNAP. Through SNAP, we found a few victims who were willing to talk. When we published our initial stories, we included a tip box with a telephone number where people could either leave a voicemail or talk to a live person. I think that man was a cold call who called up, and I answered the phone, and he said, I'm ready to talk.
Wow, okay. And Sacha, you used the word, Sara, I apologize. You used the word difficulty as well when you were describing the process of, Paterno, Sandusky, these were these godlike figures. Nobody wanted to speak ill of them. Can you give us a little more detail around that difficulty? How did you try to find people? Where did you get your breaks in terms of getting somebody to open up finally?
Initially, I only knew of one victim. He was what the prosecutors would call him victim one, because he was really the first one to be believed by the prosecutors. And he had been chased out of his own high school. His own high schoolers had gotten wind that he had reported this before there were any charges, before it was in any newspaper, before anyone knew. Word got out that he had gone to the police and made this accusation against Sandusky, and they had bullied him so badly that he had to leave the school. And so you can imagine that when I went and knocked on his mother's door to try and talk to them, they were not happy. I mean, they did not want to talk to me. They did tell me that it was the wrong, they said, he's not the same kid. You got, the same name, wrong kid. And I believed it. I mean, I believed it for a couple of days at least. I mean, I didn't want to obviously push them. And I think that all the reporters in the room will relate to the fact that, I still, and I always will, I hope, get that horrible feeling in my stomach when I have to make one of these door knocks, because they are not fun. It's not comfortable. You know that you're invading someone's life, and you're knocking on their door to talk about the worst moments of their life every time you do it. So
So you will always get that terrible feeling in
always,
your stomach.
every single time. But a lot of times I am I'm pleased to see that those people do want to talk. They want to tell their story. And so while he didn't, I was able to figure out that there were other victims, and those had not been believed. Some of them had come forward 10 years prior and had been told, go home. And those people were looking for someone who believed them. And so that's where really the beginning of my reporting began.
Okay. But so I also want to ask, with every knock on the door, with each time you had to do that, you probably learned a little bit more about your craft as a journalist. So can you just tell us a little bit about, what's the difference? The Sara who knocks on the door now, how is she different from the Sara who knocked on the door in 2009 or 2011?
Well, for one, I'm a little bit older, and I don't look like I'm 15 anymore. Hopefully. When I pull my hair back, I still do, but this television makeup makes me look a little bit older, I think. Look, I truly believe that some people talk to me because I didn't look like a reporter back, I looked like a teenager. So there was a level of comfort. Every time it's different. I hate to be a downer and not that deep, but I feel like I'm still definitely learning that process. I hope I'm always learning that. I think every person you talk to is different. There's no formula for this kind of thing, and it's still hard every single time. You have to listen to people, you have to read people, but sometimes you blow it. Sometimes I blow it, sometimes you get it right. That's a terrible answer, but that is all I have.
Yeah, this is about learning and working. I mean, that's what we do. I think that is a lot of what a craft is about, is one attempt after another. You iterate, and you keep screwing up in various ways, and you try to zigzag your way to the right outcome. But how about you, Sacha?
Well, I'm thinking back to this story when I was a really young reporter in my early 20s at the Globe, and you're often giving these General Simon stories that they give the young reporters, and it was a terrible story involving these two young women, one of whom was pregnant, who were hit head-on by a state police cruiser. Both of the girls were killed, and the unborn child was killed. I was asked to go and knock on the door of the parents. It's a terrible assignment. You expect resentment and anger that you're even showing up at the front door. So I drive out to the house, and I by the time I showed up, was visibly upset that I had to do the story. And I will never forget that me being visibly upset, in a strange way, made them react with compassion to me. And so, you learn what's obvious, though, which is that if you are compassionate and you're human, which you can be in those situations, it creates a connection. Now, I also had the interesting experience of when I first knocked on the door, I just knocked and didn't have a notebook in my hand. When the family began talking, eventually I had to pull out my notebook. And the minute I did pull that notebook out, it was almost like I had pulled a gun on them. Suddenly I was like, I was the reporter again, and they did freeze up a little. So it made me very conscious of the tools of the trade and how you use them in a way that doesn't become a barrier. But I think the basics are, you have to be a good listener, you have to be compassionate, especially with the types of interviews we were doing. You can't do those on deadline. If you have to know when you have time to talk and when you don't. And if you don't have time to give time and be compassionate, you probably shouldn't make that phone call at that moment, because people will sense that sense of rush, and that's just not going to be effective.
So say more, too. So you've started to move into the territory of the question of what your responsibility as a journalist is to sources who have had these kinds of experiences. So they need time, they need compassion and understanding, they need a certain deftness in the movement between the human and your professional responsibility. But what are the other responsibilities that you came to understand you had?
I think a lot of times now I make a conscious effort to tell people I'm interviewing, this isn't about me, right? This isn't you, because sometimes people feel like they're doing, they're giving so much to you. So I always try to take myself out of it as much as possible and say, this is about you. You're telling your story. This is, you taking ownership over it. You're almost letting them believe, think that they're taking some of that ownership away from the news organization that's going to physically write the words, because I really do believe that's true, right? We're just facilitating their stories, and I want people to know that when I'm talking to them. I think that makes it a little bit easier. We're all here to tell a story about what happened, a truthful story and a complete story, and we can't tell a complete story without the subjects that are in them. And so I try to make that clear to people who are having a hard time.
So that's really interesting. That sounds like what you're saying is you help your sources themselves become agents take agency, take ownership. That's an interesting statement in a context where what they've experienced is a really significant violation of agency.
Well, I mean, clearly these were not adversarial interviews, right? This is not us, this was not an accountability interview. These are people who are victims who were telling their stories. And so, yeah, that's the approach.
Joining you in the accountability project.
And these are often people that had not been listened to before. So I think there was a great deal of gratitude in being listened to. And I also often felt like, we were asking people to unearth very difficult things. And I often felt like we sort of dropped a bomb on their life and then we say, thank you, and we hung up the phone. And I would often call people back later, or even before I got off the phone, say, do you have someone to talk to? Is there someone in your life? I wanted them to understand that what you just unearthed is now going to continue to resonate even after we hang up the phone. The other piece of this, though, was, you don't want to push people too hard, but you do have to push people for details. Because if someone said, I was molested, you need to know what that means. There's a wide range of what that could mean. Some of the details that we were able to get sent priests to jail. So we found that we had to push sometimes in ways, but explain why we were pushing. I need to know this because that potentially could have been a crime. And I think that as long as you're explaining why you're asking, people understand what is the point of that question.
And has either of you stayed in touch in the years subsequently with?
Oh, definitely. I mean, and to your point, and this is something that I didn't quite grasp at the time, but this has obviously changed everyone's life, and some for the better and some not for the better. And now I am very much more aware of that when I cover people who are victims of sexual abuse, because you can almost, sometimes see the future, and sometimes the future is next week. And
you say not for the better. What do you mean?
Some people have really struggled with coming forward and publicly being a victim of Jerry Sandusky, and there's been a lot of backlash towards the victims by fans who have come after them and accused them of lying. And to this day, almost 5 years later, some of them were stalked, some of them are harassed online, some of them are being called liars in courtrooms, as recently as a couple weeks ago during his most recent appeal hearing. So they're not, it's not a one time, let me tell you my story and I'm done.
Right. Do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think that's well said.
Let me just turn to, as we sort of head towards our conclusion here, to ask you about the state of journalism today. Do you think, what's your assessment of how well newsrooms are equipped to do the kind of work that you both did in these stories? Are we doing okay? Thumbs up, thumbs down? What do we have to worry about?
Look, we all can complain at times, right? But we're sitting up here, and everyone else who will be sitting up here today and tomorrow was able to pull it off, was able to do it. And maybe we're not able to all do every story we want to do, but I truly still believe that you can get it done if you are careful about who you work for and, devote yourself to the craft. And I did this story nights and weekends. This is not my day job. This was something I felt really strongly about. I felt needed to be flushed out and pursued no matter what the result was going to be. I had no idea that it was going to become this big, and my former colleagues still make fun of me for that all the time. I was completely unaware that this was going to be a big deal. So you can still do it, and if it's not, it's easier if anything else, because there are all of these avenues and these tools to get it done, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely correct about the technology. I'm a little more pessimistic only because in my industry in particular, newspapers, we're clearly an industry in decline. I mean, our whole business model, our whole revenue model was destroyed, and no one has figured out how to resolve it yet. Craigslist destroyed the classified advertising revenue we brought in. The availability of free stories online destroyed people's need to have to subscribe to a newspaper. So most newspapers are much smaller than they used to be. Many of them don't print at all. Many only print a few days a week. I think the journalism is excellent. The Globe Spotlight team is now larger than it was when I was on it, but many newspapers don't have investigative teams or investigative reporters anymore. It's viewed as an expensive luxury. I can't afford to have that reporter not in the paper for a few months. And that means that in many states there aren't even reporters covering the State House. I mean, of all the State House should be covered. We're talking about accountability of our politicians. So I think that I have concerns that investigative reporting is a bit of an endangered species, at least as robustly as we saw it happen in the past. But there are many newspapers trying to figure out how to not make that so. So I'm hopeful that we will figure out a way to, with fewer resources, still do good work.
Yeah, thanks. So I would be remiss too if I didn't mention the whole, Academy Awards thing, movie thing, and so forth. So what was it like to be played by Rachel McAdams?
Well, we had this, I kind of view it as a reporter. We got this fascinating chance to look behind the curtain of Hollywood, which most people don't get a glimpse of. But one of the things we saw that was really wonderful is how hard those actors work to be as good as they are. I mean, most people only see them on the screen or on the red carpet. We saw them do their homework, make their phone calls. They spent hours with us in person and on phone getting to know us. Only when we saw the movie did we realize, we saw them suddenly depicting mannerisms we had, and even more strangely, sometimes mannerisms we didn't realize we had.
So what was the one you noticed about yourself? I've got to ask now.
I'm always sort of playing with my fingers, and I'm aware, but I didn't think other people noticed, and throughout the movie you see her do this. And
that's great.
But she told me later that sometimes when we would take walks together, she would try to subtly drop behind me to examine my gait. And so I didn't realize that all the time we spent together that we thought was primarily social was research and dissection and analysis for them.
So she just didn't pull out the notebook. That was the only difference. It's been such an honor and pleasure and privilege to speak with both of you. Thank you.
Thank you.